Welcome to the Changing Conversations podcast by SGS, where we explore industry advancements and sustainability initiatives. In this special 2-episode series titled Trust in AI, we will delve into the intersection of testing, inspection, and certification and artificial intelligence. I'm Tomislav Nad, Lead Innovation Technology at SGS, and I'm thrilled to host the discussion today. Join us as we navigate the complexities of AI regulation and its impact on industry, aiming to provide a comprehensive understanding of how AI can be responsibly integrated into business practices. In today's episode, we will discuss the regulatory perspective on AI, focusing on the key risks, the necessity of regulation, and the challenges associated with implementing the EU AI Act. We are honored to have two distinguished guests, Jeremy Rollison, Head of EU Policy at Microsoft, and Gabriele Mazzini from the European Commission, architect and lead author of the EU AI Act. Jeremy, may I ask you to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Jeremy Rollison. I'm head of EU policy here at Microsoft's European Government Affairs Office. I manage a team that engages across all kinds of different regulatory topics. And as you can imagine, these days, the EU AI Act and a lot of the digital initiatives from the European Commission impacting AI are keeping us pretty busy. Thank you.
How about you, Gabriele?
Hello, my name is Gabriele Mazzini, and I'm team leader for the AI Act of the European Commission. Notably, I've been the architect and the lead author of the AI Act. I worked for the European Commission since 2017, first in a role focusing on the liability implications of new technologies, and then since 2019, I've been focusing exclusively on developing the AI Act and its negotiation.
Thank you very much, Gabriele. So I quickly introduce myself as well. So I'm Tomislav Nad. I'm Lead Innovation Technology at SGS. And my role is basically analyzing the impact of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, impact on our business and the businesses of our customers, basically. Good. Let's dive into the topic today. It's a very exciting topic. A lot of things are discussed around the globe. The EU Act had made some impact and impression over the last years, and it's an important piece of legislation, the first such comprehensive legislation for artificial intelligence. So let's begin with our discussion and think about the necessity and challenges of AI regulation in general, and in particular of the EU AI Act. So Gabriele, what are the key risks when developing or using AI, and why do you think regulation is necessary?
Yeah, this is a fundamental question, right? Why certain regulation is needed? Because, of course, the policymakers deem that there are some risks that certain products or services or the use of certain technology in those products and services may create. And I was just yesterday a bit reviewing my notes, and, we had one of the first references to the risk and opportunities of emerging technologies already in 2017. So there is a European Council conclusion in 2017 that basically asked the Commission to develop a European approach on AI because indeed, and I quote, these technologies must be developed ensuring a high level of data protection, digital rights, and ethical standards. So essentially, this was one of the first policy statements of influential institutional actor like the European Council. Around the risk of new technologies. And so that led, of course, to a number of following initiatives, but essentially all were centered around the fact that AI creates some risks around health and safety. Let's think, for instance, about AI embodied in products, and therefore those products may lead to health and safety risk for humans or also for property. And risk around fundamental rights. Of course, fundamental rights is a very large concept. I mean, if you look at the charter, it's really a long list of fundamental rights. And not all of them may be equally impacted by AI. And I would also say the AI Act certainly doesn't cover all of them, strictly speaking. But let's think, for instance, about cases where AI assists humans in making decisions in critical situations, like, for instance, in the workplace or in educational institution, or in a law enforcement context. So there we are facing risk around, for instance, the lack of opacity, the lack of transparency about those systems, or indeed, on a substantive note, more the risk that those decisions may be discriminatory. So indeed, there is a plethora of risk, but roughly speaking, certainly the AI Act focuses on risk around health and safety and
All right, thank you. So how did you approach the call for AI regulation. So you mentioned a couple of risks, or the most important risk, which is covered by the EU AI Act. But how did you start with that? How did you look into that and then decide what things need to be regulated? What risks are the key risks should be covered by the EU AI Act, for example?
Yeah, that's a very good question. When I think back indeed about the origin of the process leading to the AI Act, as you know, and as I just hinted at, so of course it didn't come out of the blue. So there were a number of statements, initiatives, including by the European Parliament. Actually, the European Parliament was the first institution that developed a recommendation on robotics in 2017, calling for a regulatory framework there. But indeed, there's been a process where we had the work of the high-level expert group for close to 2 years. They developed, for instance, a document called Ethical Guidelines for Trustworthy AI. And in those documents, they both identified a number of risks and also a number of key requirements, right, for AI to be trustworthy. The Commission later developed a white paper. The white paper led to wide-ranging consultation on what could be possibly a regulatory option. In fact, one of the main distinctions between what is the, say, ethical guidelines of the high-level expert group and what is actually a concrete regulatory proposal by the Commission is the fact they have different nature. In fact, ethical guidelines cover issues that may already be covered by other existing legal frameworks. And that is exactly the exercise when we looked at how do we actually transform, let's say, a set of ethical principles into a regulatory proposal. We looked at what were the possible gaps that existing legislation will not cover. Considering, just to give you an example, the existence of data protection legislation, which applies regardless of the type of tools that's used for the processing of personal data, then there was, from our perspective, no need to reopen that question specifically on AI. And so essentially, indeed, the way we went through this process is really trying to identify what kind of legal framework already exists and how some of those risks, like for instance around privacy, are already taken care of those legal frameworks. And therefore, where is the best place for the Act to intervene to ensure that certain areas, indeed around health, safety, and fundamental rights that are not necessarily tackled, could be further tackled in the AI Act.
Thank you very much. So looking backwards, what do you think were the main challenges when writing the AI Act and obviously getting approved and getting through the all instances so that we, at the end, we have now the first AI regulation in the European Union?
I think certainly timing. I think this technology evolves very fast, as we know very well. So identifying a point of time when we want to somewhat crystallize a set of rules that would work for today, but ideally also for the future, because we want to make sure that legislation is not something that you should change very quickly. I mean, normally you should give a basic framework stable to ensure indeed that it caters for problems that exist today, but also, may possibly emerge in the future. So the time of the regulation wasn't one challenge. And the way we dealt with it was to choose a regulatory approach, which is the new legislative framework. The new legislative framework, which is known for those who are more familiar with product legislation, aims to put in place a number of, I would say, high-level essential requirements for products, meaning a number of requirements that the product, in this case the AI system, needs to comply with. But then the technical specifications of those essential requirements are demanding to standardization, or otherwise technical solutions that provider can choose. So in this way, you do not need to amend the law too quickly, because indeed technical specifications can evolve. Another perhaps complexity of the AI Act, another challenge, was the horizontal approach. What I mean by that, the Act being a horizontal approach, meaning it applies to AI across sectors. So the legislator decided, so the Commission first, and then the co-legislator decided not to intervene by updating sectoral legislation. Take, for instance, financial services or law enforcement or employment law or products. So creating, let's say, amendment to existing legislation, updating it, that legislation to cater for possible additional risk or challenges brought by AI, but instead opted for creating one single legal framework that would apply to a number of different use cases across the board. And therefore, it was important to ensure that that legal framework would properly interact with existing legislation. So on the one hand, it would not overlap, would not contradict, and also properly, there would be a functional relationship. And that has been an effort we spent a considerable amount of time, because indeed, we want to make sure that we could leverage existing frameworks and being able to create a system that would not disrupt, for instance, existing structures. Therefore, a number of sectorial specificities have been taken into consideration, whether it's in the framework of the financial services or in the context of law enforcement. And perhaps just quickly going back to the first point about the standards, certainly, I think one of the challenges, and I think this is where indeed the Commission is heavily invested now, is to make sure, of course, that these standards are in place on time.
All right, thank you. So the first initial draft was published 2021, right? And in the past 3 years, there were several changes, especially after the big hype around large language models. So can you summarize what are the main changes compared to the initial draft 3 years ago?
Yeah, I would say that there are certainly, off the top of my mind, I would say 2 very important changes, maybe 3, that somehow reflect a bit of a change in approach. And then there are, of course, a number of, I would say, more physiological changes about should we have more or less high risk, should we have more or less prohibitions. So in terms of what I could describe possibly as more conceptual changes, the first one is certainly around, as you mentioned, the large language models, so the foundation model. The Commission approach was focused on end application. So an AI system with an intended purpose is an end application. And the regulation was tailored to that end application, and depending on the type of risk, the regulation would be different. The co-legislator opted after the emergence of ChatGPT, and so these large language models, it really came to the market, to essentially regulate also the model, the foundation model. And that is certainly a significant change, because on the one hand, it moves the regulation from the system to the model. And on the other hand, identifies, therefore, a number of specific rules for the component of the final application, including a number of additional risk. And the final text foresees, in fact, 2 sets of rules, one for, let's say, baseline all foundation models, and another one for those models that create systemic risk. So here we have indeed also a concept of a new risk, a sort of systemic risk. Another important shift from my perspective was the fact that the co-legislator added quite substantive obligations on the side of the deployer. The Commission proposal focused on, even the term was different, the user of the system, which was meant to have quite significantly less obligation compared to the manufacturer or the provider. So the main burden was the provider of the system, who had, for instance, when the system is high risk, to ensure compliance with the requirement. This shift, this balance of obligation has shifted by indeed maintaining essentially the same obligations for the provider of the system, but increasing the obligation for the user who has been renominated the deployer. For instance, let's think one example, but it's not the only one, about the fundamental rights impact assessment. And finally, perhaps the last change I'd like to mention is the fact that, from my perspective, a number of provisions have been added that somewhat are related to privacy. So if you think, for instance, about the ban on emotional recognition. So emotional recognition, strictly speaking, is a form of profiling, in the sense that you are predicting the behavior of the characteristics of a certain person, or similar, like biometric categorization is a form of profiling. So we see that the number of provisions that have been added are somewhat either overlapping or somewhat modifying, if you want, certain existing rules, notably in privacy legislation.
All right, thank you. Now, coming to you, Jeremy, since Microsoft is a major AI technology provider, what's your point of view on key risks when developing AI, and how do you see the necessity of regulation?
Well, listen, I think, as Gabriele said, it's one of the main questions here. I think at the highest level, you want to make sure that these systems that are increasingly powerful can't be misused. I think that's kind of the main risk that everyone wants to avoid. And when I say that, it's misused by nefarious actors, or even misused by actors that are deploying it in certain scenarios. And if the system isn't designed properly, well, misuse can occur even unintentionally. So really mitigating the risks is, goes across a different set of criteria that you have to look at. One of the things that we're focused on, and where our own responsible AI journey has focused at Microsoft, one of the core principles we have there is really making sure that these systems are designed, with fairness in mind, with adequate degrees of transparency, mitigating against some of the bias that can occur in these outputs based on the way the data was trained and certain oversights that could have taken place. There's a responsibility there for human oversight as well that I think is figured into at least all of the standards and instructions that we've provided over the years towards the way that we're developing AI internally. There has to be a degree of what I think is often referred to kind of as, sustainability, and there's limits to some of that, of course, but, these systems need to make sure that we're not inadvertently bringing bias into the system. We want to make sure there's a degree of accountability where humans can undo any unintended harm caused by the systems. The transparency and ability to explain some of the decision-making processes so that this can be understood and trusted by the users that are using it. Privacy is another one of the core principles that we've landed on in terms of AI that needs to be designed to protect user privacy and handle that data responsibly. And then kind of back to the top of what I talked about, making sure these are systems that are safe and secure. AI systems can have vulnerabilities that need to be addressed to prevent that misuse or any of the harm. But I think it really focuses around kind of the misuse side and malicious use, making sure that we're doing what we have to do as a technology company to prepare and develop tools that can't be misused. And then addressing a lot of the complexity and uncertainty around that. There are regulatory challenges that come up in that context as well, making sure that what we're developing and how we're rolling that out is consistent with the different types of rules. It's not just one regulation, I think, that needs to be kept in mind. But overall, you really want to make sure that you're prohibiting or preventing the misuse of this at a large or small scale, whether that's intended or not. And again, the core concepts around transparency and security and privacy, responsibility and accountability, or at least the core concepts that we've looked at in terms of emphasizing the risks that need to be mitigated.
Thank you very much. So moving on to the impact on the industry deregulation might have. So Jeremy, so obviously you're providing AI technology for quite some time already, and you didn't start with the EU regulation to look into the risks you need to address when using and deploying AI. So how do you see the impact of the regulation on your industry or in general?
Well, it's a great question because I think it's still early days to a degree. There's been, as Gabriele mentioned, the AI Act has been discussed for quite some time now. I think over the past 5 years, amidst a lot of regulatory activity in the digital space coming from the European Commission, the AI Act was a rather deliberative process. They've been talking about this for quite some time. There's been a lot of stakeholder consultation. So it's been adopted. I think we're waiting for the entry into force now. So it is technically early days, but we've been familiar with these concepts and looking at it already for quite some time. And we're already looking into the compliance side of that. Before diving into the AI Act, I think it's also important to remember that much of the AI systems that have been on the market and the AI that we've been developing and people have been using, this is not an unregulated space. Discrimination is still illegal, whether it's done with an AI system or not. There are other rules that are in place, GDPR rules and the like, that use of these systems is still overwhelmingly regulated. And this year in particular, over the past 18 months or 2 years, with announcements and developments in generative AI, rules have popped up all over the world. Other jurisdictions are looking at this space, and whether that's update to procurement rules to make sure that governments are procuring safe and responsible AI systems, whether it's horizontal approaches that have been taken, like in the EU, whether it's sector-specific rules. There's an increasing amount of regulatory activity all over the globe, and you can see that reflected in international efforts for codes of conduct and the like. So I think it's a space that's already been regulated for many of the outcomes and many of the risks that were there in a pre-AI era. What's different about the Act is there is a lot of ambition here. And while it's early days, you can still see that, as Gabriele said, the technology moves really quickly in this space. We were talking about the AI Act for quite some time before anyone had heard of generative AI or foundation models. One of the challenges then is when some of these new and exciting announcements are made, you have to move quickly to make sure that the regulation can capture and address any of the risks that might emerge. In doing so, it takes time. And as you're taking time, there are new technological advancements. So the challenge is always making sure you have a principles-based approach that stands that test of time and is future-proof insofar as it can be, and really focused on the highest category of risk. So I think in the AI Act, one approach that was taken, as Gabriele mentioned, is this risk-based approach. We want to focus rules, and I think where we're seeing jurisdictions around the world look at this is really focusing rules and obligations where there's the highest degree of risk. And I think part of these regulatory efforts require more and more education to understand what we're really talking about with AI. There is a product safety background from which to leverage some of this. Gabriele mentioned the NLF as a starting point, but AI is such that, this is increasingly a complex ecosystem, everything from the infrastructure layer all the way to the application layer, and different players in that chain, have different sets of responsibilities or different possibilities to mitigate some of those risks. So when you're coming out with rules, those need to be tailored to where a player may be in that technology stack, as we like to talk about it. And again, being familiar with the different possibilities at those different layers, once again, requires a large degree of consultation. When you look at the AI Act and even some of the political compromises that were made, we and other customers of ours and players across Europe are still wondering, where you fit into these obligations. When do you become provider of a system versus a developer and the like, and what's triggered by that? What triggers high use obligations in terms of what environments you're rolling out this, what the environments you're rolling this out in, what type of decisions you might be making. So right now, I think with the kind of rush to get this adopted before the elections and the like, we're parsing through the text to understand a bit better, what some of the new definitions mean, what this will mean for specific products and specific services, what type of documentation requirements are going to be needed, what type of engineering changes we have to put in place to mitigate risks, what can be dealt with contractually. There's a lot of questions right now that I think stakeholders have across the spectrum. It's a rather dense text, but it's an ambitious text, and there's an opportunity there to set a standard of sorts. And I think one of the important things to keep in mind is, as this technology is increasingly an ecosystem of partnerships and the like, much of that transcends borders. So ensuring that approaches that are taken in one jurisdiction align insofar as possible to what's happening outside of Europe is super important. And it's important because talent finds itself across borders, data is across borders, infrastructure can be across borders. And we have some starting points to learn from. I think we take a lot of inspiration from the aviation space, where we can have, an international civil aviation authority identifying the right standards and developing norms that each country can then approach with their own regulatory approach and culture, but still agreeing on core concepts. We don't have to rebuild planes in the air when they're taking off from one capital to another. With AI, that international alignment is going to be more important than ever, as we see this technology just being more and more increasingly important to all things economic growth. So the importance of standards, which ones are applicable in this space, which ones exist that can be used even for presumptions of conformity to certain of the new provisions in the EU AI Act as a more European specific answer. But I think it's early days, and right now stakeholders across the spectrum are trying to just make sure they understand what's in the text, how this should be interpreted, how it's expected to be enforced, so you can plan compliance accordingly with the staggered set of deadlines that have been introduced.
So how ready do you think is the industry for the regulation? So not just Microsoft, but you have a huge customer base who are building all kinds of great AI application on top of Azure, for example. So what is your impression?
No, it's a fantastic question. And, it's very easy to say that it depends. And it really does depend. I think it depends on what type of activity somebody in that industry is engaged in, whether you're, deploying models, whether you're building with these models, whether you're using AI systems in this context versus another context. It really depends on the degree to which you're engaged in some of those high risk environments, potentially, or the degree to which you're leveraging some of the more powerful AI tools. And then it also depends a lot on how ready you've been internally with a compliance culture and atmosphere to prepare yourself for such an ambitious regulation. Experiences with GDPR and, data governance obligations there and data governance practices. Those who have prioritized that, I think, are in a better spot in terms of, mitigating some of the risks and complying with the obligations in the AI Act. Companies like ours, I think, feel more ready than we would be, having put in place a responsible AI standard already many, many years ago. So much of what we're doing to mitigate risks of the systems that our engineers are building, we hope aligns to a lot of the expectations in the Act. Again, it requires a little bit of comparison to what standards need to be used and updating things for some of the new and speedier release of these technologies, and kind of even anticipating in the future, how will this fit into such a framework? So I think it really depends on how ready everyone is. If you've been engaged in this for quite some time and familiar with a lot of the rules and regulations coming out of Europe, I think you're in a better place. But for those that might be new to the market, that are leveraging, models at a different layer in the chain, or leveraging systems at a different layer in the chain, it really varies from one sector to the next. You see some sectors with a lot more experience and history and in highly regulated industries that I think probably have higher degrees of preparedness. But I think everyone is still at a question stage at the moment, just really understanding some of the terms that were ultimately adopted, many of which are a little bit, unprecedented. We don't have existing definitions for some of that. These are new concepts and new terminologies. Understanding the policymakers' intention there and understanding how this will be enforced, having some of those dialogues, I think are going to be really important. Preparedness also probably requires a degree of familiarity with the processes that are in the text. There's still space within the text where rules will be clarified, either in the form of codes of practice, with new standards that need to be developed. So there's a bit of a moving target of sorts with some of that. And I think the good news is that's aimed at making sure this is future-proof. So we have, a journey that kind of continues as new technological advancements and new risks are identified. We have a bit of flexibility there, but it also makes it harder to know today exactly what you might have to do. So I really think it depends on where you are in the stack, where you are in terms of making some of these decisions, and what type of experience and familiarity you have with compliance with such ambitious rules from Europe and elsewhere.
So considering Microsoft is a global company and the EU Act is mainly a European legislation, so can you say something about how the EU AI Act impacts the use of AI on a global level?
Absolutely. And that's one of the core questions we're looking at from a compliance perspective. Europe is a very, very large market. Standards and approaches that are taken in Europe, we've seen in the past, can certainly be duplicated and inspire the approaches taken in other jurisdictions and other markets. This is a unique opportunity, I think, and I think the EU deserves a lot of credit for, yes, moving first in this space. What I like to say is, the benefit of moving first is that you have that opportunity to set a standard that everyone else will follow. The risk is that, others may watch to see what works and what doesn't work and keep the good bits and perhaps, take a different approach on other bits based on what they see and how it lands in the market. But I think it certainly is a large enough market and a first mover advantage there that we're paying close attention to and seeing the degree to which, we will need to roll most of these changes out globally. But really at first, we just have to understand a bit more what's exactly expected and required from some of the new provisions. Once we see that, we're going to be compliant with this. We're committed to compliance across all of the obligations and across even much of the compliance. We want to help facilitate and do what we can as a technology provider for our customers' use of our AI systems and our AI products and services. But Europe has an opportunity there. I think, there's still early days in terms of how we interpret certain terms and what's expected there, to see whether there's other jurisdictions that may approach certain things differently and develop certain international standards around that. But, make no mistake, I think the way that Europe goes, there are a lot of other eyes and ears watching this from around the world, but they're also regulating in their own way. So we're committed to compliance in Europe across our products and services, and look forward to continuing to have dialogues to make sure we're getting that right and meeting the expectation of policymakers and regulators. But as everyone around the world is regulating this space now, there is a small race of sorts to see, which approaches end up being the most effective. Well, the good news is I think there is a consensus emerging around really the important parts. The risk-based approach that the EU introduced, I think you're seeing that inspiring other approaches around the world. So insofar as some of the core concepts are there, I do think the EU will set a standard of sorts in that space. And then in the details, we'll have to see how all of this continues to emerge.
Thank you. So I would also a little bit add from our perspective, basically, and because obviously we have also a huge customer base across the globe. And we also see that a lot of customers are affected by this regulation. If you just look at the AI adoption across all kinds of industries, and since we are active in all kinds of industries, we see it quite well. Adoption is increasing, is already high compared to other emerging technologies, and it's continued to increase. It will increase over time, as we see that AI will become a major part of all kinds of technologies at the end. We also see that our customers there's a certain level of uncertainty if they're affected by regulation, what they need to do in order to comply with it if they're affected, which shows me that one important effect of the EU AI Act and similar regulations is that although the AI Act focuses mainly on high-risk applications, everybody who is using AI in their system need to start to ask some key questions. So if I'm using it or applying AI, what kind of risks I have with using it? And is the risk so high that I need to comply with the EU AI Act? Or is the risk so high that I actually need to do some significant step in order to minimize the risks if it's harming human life or fundamental rights? So really like that at the end, although it's just high-risk applications, everybody first need to start and look into their own application of AI system and see, all right, is the risk high when I'm using it? And then answer the question for themselves and then continue whatever is necessary to do. I would also like to add a question about the following. So if you look the first proposal of the AI Act, and then the large language, well, let's say ChatGPT came out, and there was a huge hype around large language models and what cool and amazing things they're able to do. What I noticed is that the perception of the necessity of regulation changed significantly globally. So before the hype around large language models, I would say not many were in favor of regulation in general on AI, but that has changed significantly because the awareness about risks using AI has changed tremendously as well with the hype around large language models, which is still continuing. So what do you think, Gabriele, from your perspective? What were the major things which have changed with ChatGPT and all the other large language models came into public and showing what they can do?
I share your perspective that the emergence of ChatGPT certainly triggered some concerns around this new technology. I think there was probably ChatGPT may have caught by surprise some experts, but maybe not. I mean, experts knew that LLMs, language models are around, they were being developed. Indeed, I think ChatGPT was a model GPT-3, so we had already earlier versions, like GPT-2 and so on. So I feel what changed was the fact that putting those systems, through this chatbot interface on the market, I think made AI visible to large amount of the population. And I think that is what essentially, attracted a lot of attention also by the media. And as a consequence, also policymakers had felt the urge to deal with that. So I think this is, maybe it's a very simple explanation, but I think simply from my perspective, this is what happened. And therefore, the need to somewhat intervene, both, I have to say, on the side of the council and on the side of the parliament, although in different ways, because the councils still tried to align whatever new rules they had in mind for general purpose AI systems to somewhat the risk-based approach. That was a very clear intention. And so I would say first is focusing on a general purpose AI system. So again, on a final end product, and then aligning it with the risk-based approach. So to the extent that kind of system, may be used in high-risk applications. Whereas on the side of the parliament, we had a different approach by indeed focusing on the regulation of the foundation model. So departing from the system level or from the application level. And ultimately, we had a final consolidation in the text looking indeed at the model sort of under the term general purpose AI model. I think time will tell whether that approach was the right approach. I certainly feel that some of the instances that triggered the concerns should have been dealt, or actually are already dealt in the context of other legal frameworks. Think, for instance, questions around misinformation, which is typically, is a matter that as more related to type of platform legislation as more to product legislation. And then I think one other question that, for my mind, was deserving considerations in that discussion around the emergence of ChatGPT was about the balance of power between actors, in the value chain. So the moment downstream applications are more and more dependent on certain, let's say more powerful component like foundation models, how do we make sure that downstream users or downstream deployers who actually want to integrate those systems and those models into their product actually do have the right information to ensure compliance downstream when, for instance, they deploy a certain model in a high-risk application. So I leave it there. But I think certainly, it was not easy for the legislator to deal with this new phenomenon. I think certainly it was a complex, very complex issue.
But Jeremy, what do you think? So did all the hype around the large language helped? What's your point of view?
I think it was interesting to see the timing of some of this as well. I mean, without getting too much into the EU legislative process details, the council, as he mentioned, and member states, when they finalized their position, that was the same week that public availability of ChatGPT was announced. So much of the deliberations had been done without any familiarity around foundation models and generative AI and some of the new challenges. But absolutely, once we saw the excitement and spread, I think, of this new technology that was touching so many people, arguably, one of the first moments that AI really became real. Everyone was using this, at a daily basis. Policymakers, of course, saw that attention. And I think it was completely understandable that not just in Europe, but around the world, we were impressed by the power of some of this technology. But anytime you have a situation like that, you can also imagine what some of the risks might be. So there were a lot of valid questions being raised and concerns being raised about the future of this technology. How quick is it moving? How powerful is it? And amidst that conversation, while legislative discussions on the AI Act were already relatively advanced, of course, policymakers wanted to seize the opportunity to capture some of these new, unique risks that such a technology was driving. So it's a really good example of how quickly technology can move in that space. Familiarity with a lot of the core concepts that take time and new concepts that emerge as we saw all of the excitement come out of the rollout from generative AI. The challenge there, of course, also was meeting certain political deadlines that were in place. You wanted to make sure while you had this opportunity that you were covering all your bases. And I think policymakers, did their best to familiarize themselves with some of the core concepts and some of the core risks and challenges there to make sure that's addressed in a text that we do want to make sure stands the test of time. So it's a really good example of how quickly the technology moves. And even since those arguably now early days, which were 18 months, 2 years ago, there's been a lot of new exciting advancements, whether it's more advanced models, whether there's different deployment scenarios that are occurring, and we'll see a continuing amount of innovation in that space. So I do think it was a great example of where, once again, I think the European Union was one of the first to approach that, but you see the challenge there of trying to approach something in a way that captures all the horizontal considerations possible, and then technological advancements and announcements are made that force a revisiting of some of these core concepts. Gabriele mentioned general purpose AI models. Right now, we have a text that looks at general purpose AI systems, that looks at general purpose AI models, and then there are models with systemic risk. There are different categories of that. So it can definitely create a bit of confusion when you're thinking about something more simply just as AI as such. But at the same time, there are differences between many of these systems. What we were talking about pre-generative AI in terms of AI systems was much, much different than I think what we've been talking about post ChatGPT announcements in the context of the AI Act. I think the scope of the AI Act expanded significantly from the outset towards where it landed. I think it's safe to say this captures most AI that's on the market in just about any form. But once again, you want to make sure there's a focus on that high risk category. I think the risk-based approach is a principle that will be duplicated and inspire regulation around the world. It seems like the smart approach. But if everything is ultimately high risk, there's not as much of a risk-based approach left than in the first place. So technology is moving really quickly. And I think the AI Act and its deliberation was a brilliant example of where that can be an opportunity or a challenge. And once again, how well we have effectively addressed that, would depend on how much flexibility we have in the text moving forward as new announcements come and they fit into these definitions. And hopefully there's still a dialogue with regulators to understand how some of these new concepts will apply themselves to things that are going to be new in a year or two.
It's indeed amazing times to work in this area and to see how such a piece of technology or one application can actually impact legislation and the development of regulation. And with that, we bring this episode to a close. Thank you for listening. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss our next episode where we'll continue the discussion. We'll be joined by Jeremy and Gabriele to discuss the role of the tech industry, how rapid development of AI technology is addressed, and about the shared responsibility across the AI technology stack. A special thank you to our guests, Jeremy Rollison and Gabriele Mazzini, for their valuable insights today. Stay tuned for more engaging discussions and industry insights. And remember the importance of AI regulation in shaping a secure and efficient future.